Welcome to Windows on the World. Got a very good show for you tonight. And these shows are part of my education, and that's why I put so much into this, because it is indeed a lifelong learning project, and I hope you're finding it useful too. The feedback that I get does tend to validate that also, which is great. So tonight, you own nothing, be happy. Own nothing and be happy. We've heard that before, haven't we? We're going to be exploring what it actually means. The fear of loss should be over only what is really worth keeping. And tonight, what it really means to own nothing and be happy through the importance of language, meaning what you say and saying exactly what you mean. The only thing you own is actually what is in your mind. It comes from your mind, and the outcomes of your own intentions are the most important thing that you can possibly own, and the only things that you do actually own. And in our show called The Ancient Faith, Truth Keepers, the point was made that a vow of poverty is actually living outside material needs and putting lifelong development first. The true purpose then was of attaining knowledge and improving understanding to the highest possible level. Putting that knowledge to practical use and heightening skills such as intuition and connection to the highest source was then paramount. This came above all material things. In a show called The First Global Language with Stephen Strong, we exclusively revealed the first 10 words of a global language which is actually believed to have originated in Australia. The author and historian Frederick Slater was derided and ridiculed for suggesting such a thing as a global pictorial language had ever existed. And before this, of course, he was actually the go-to person on Australian history. But once you step outside the accepted narrative of controlled popular opinion, we all know what happens, or we should do by now. Well, this language that Slater talked of differed from any normal verbal and written form of communication in one major way. Its whole purpose was to refine communication through the use of the words which themselves were there to elevate the use of language into a higher form of communication, and this in turn would improve the mind. And of course the understanding of the bigger picture, the unseen reality over the material and the visible. It would elevate the mindset and abilities of those who used it correctly and consistently. It would over time facilitate telepathy and refine the whole mindset. The use of the words had to be carefully considered, and in this consideration one would refine one's own mindset through discrimination and perfection of one's own vocabulary through these words that had very profound meaning. Well, compare that with the language of today and the use of language today. There is also another very good reason in the present to actually refine your mindset, though. If you do not use your mind to bring forth refined concepts, you are getting close to being the assumed property of third parties. In short, you are defined as an incompetent, an imbecile, and ultimately deemed to be property of the parish. An incompetent, an imbecile, or even a monster. These are old concepts, but they are not that old. We're only going back a few hundred years here. So, if we add this concept to the refinement and careful use of all meaningful words, and the idea that the utterance of the words is specific and for the advancement of the spirit, then communication on a higher level can and should be attained. When we cannot find the word for an experience or divine revelation, it is because our vocabulary does not carry such meanings. But what if it did? What if words had to be used much more precisely and carefully, and this was their utmost and important function? Well, moving this idea onto the oral tradition, which we have already talked about, the idea that the oral tradition was there to sharpen memory and keep knowledge in its original form for those that would truly preserve it is a very important point. Therefore, only written triggers would be needed, as in bullet points. These would be just snippets of information which would not give anything away to outsiders or adversaries. This indicated the need for privacy and of gaining information through a process of graduated learning. So, if the utterance of words and their power was in the very way they were conveyed, then it would make sense to do this, wouldn't it? Minimise the writing of words and emphasise the utterance of the words, how they were said and why we said them. This would mean we had full ownership of the words we uttered and full responsibility for their meaning and the effect they had on those who heard them. In other words, taking full responsibility for our actions. Of course, in a system like this, we wouldn't have anything such as hate speak, because that's a definition which is of someone taking something personally, or it's a subjective view of something which someone has said. And of course, if we had perfect communication, none of that would ever happen or even be an issue, which is why, of course, it is an issue and why language has been restricted. It's all about control. So even this, as we know, was exploited in the past. For instance, here's a good analogy for you. Speaker's Corner in London was not where you went to air your opinions. It was originally where you uttered your last words before being hung from the Tyburn tree. And that's a really important point. So it's a cynical thing to have a thing called Speaker's Corner on the site of where people uttered their last words. And if the words we uttered really mattered to us and had internal power and special meaning, one could, at the highest level, never be misunderstood, misquoted, or misrepresented. This would be the perfection of language as communication. You must own your own words. Your words and actions are the only thing you can ever own. Well, for the sake of clarity, we will define ownership. What it means in the minds of people and what it really means in this system that we operate in. And most importantly, the only thing you truly own is what is in your own mind and the consequences of actions arising from your own intentions. You cannot own anything else. You actually own nothing. Therefore, the idea that as a finite being you own anything is misunderstood. The old laws on land use were of stewardship and temporary use. This is known as an interest in the land. In modern parlance, a usufructuary interest. Being a steward meant looking after the land for God as it was granted to you by God. So, when a corporate entity such as the Vatican assumed ownership, they did it under God but had no authority except through their own claim. And a claim is just that. It doesn't mean it has any standing. But because they imposed the claim on the people accepted the claim because they were threatened by this third party. So any corporate land ownership which does not accept that it is ultimately the property of the creator, and anyone who doesn't take this seriously is a land pirate by definition. We have also been led into a materialistic view of the world. This is to keep the focus on material needs over our own advancement. A simple trick that was used on the pharaohs, of course, and their death cult, because that's what that was all about in ancient Egypt. They believed that material objects could be utilised by the dead. This is a system for control of simple minds and nothing more. Well, the phrase "you can't take it all with you" actually says it all, doesn't it? Getting on to a recent quote from the Global Steering Group, the World Economic Forum, this has been passed around, this quote, millions of times. "You will own nothing and be happy." A much repeated quote, originally from the World Economic Forum and in an article published by the World Economic Forum from Swedish Social Democrat Ida Auken. From the interpretation of this concept, we can learn what it actually means. The origin of this much mentioned but misunderstood phrase is from an idea by Ida Auken to provide a service which leased all household appliances from a provider who would then be responsible for repairs, servicing and upgrades. Well, most people think this is about the usurping of ownership of what you deem to be yours by a corporate outside entity who have taken over what you believe to be yours by some kind of self-proclaimed rights. The article which pushed this into the public actually stated, "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better." The article is a future concept based in a city of the future where the narrator does not own a car, a house, appliances, or clothes. The author states it was merely to start discussions about technical development. The main point here is that a third party or parties own everything and you lease it all from them. Owning nothing and being happy, though, is in its true sense on a higher level of understanding, and it's something any advanced thinker actually already knows. For instance, I have had in my possession a number of cars, a property, clothes, etc., and all the above items that were listed in this article which I read earlier. I don't own the majority of them anymore, and those things that I have in close proximity can all be replaced. Well, this does not include the most important and valuable information in print and video on hard drives, the stuff which I cannot keep in my head. That's the only thing that I carry around that is valuable, stuff that I can't carry in my head. All the material things I can replace. They're easy to replace. So it would take me a very long time to replace an archive on a hard drive, but everything else is utterly replaceable or quite useless when you think that all of this stuff is transitory. However, to get to the point, I never actually legally owned the cars or the property. I had use of them for a particular period of time. When I bought the car, I signed a V5 registration document. This document was giving the property to the DVLA through registration. So once the V5 document is sent to the Driver and Vehicle Licensing Centre, it is owned by them by default. You've given it to them. They own the property. You have use of the property under their terms. Because what you've signed is, in effect, a contractual agreement, and it's the registration document. When you register something, you are giving the title to somebody else or to another entity, or transferring the title. After I signed the document under their conditions, they were the true owners. I paid tax to them and adhered to their conditions. If I did not pay their tax, they would seize their property, which was the vehicle. If I did not insure it, the police would seize it. So I sold the vehicle. I had use of it and was responsible to third parties when I had use of it. The new owner did the same as me and transferred the property by filling the V5 registration document and sending it back to the DVLA again. So it was a large material object which I never truly owned. Same with the property. It was leasehold. I owned the lease, not the property. Even freehold is not ownership. It is all usufruct. The lease had to be renewed. If I didn't renew the lease when necessary at the end of the old lease, I would have lost usufruct of the property. So you have an interest in the property that you are using. The Crown can compulsory purchase the property, also known as compulsory purchase, or in America, eminent domain. So when the government takes it for some reason, they might want to build a new road through your area and your house is in the way. We, of course, saw this with the HS2 project in Britain, which I think has been scuppered for the time being. And lots of houses and land was compulsory purchased. Well, this is not, however, a problem if one knows that one cannot own material property. The problem arises when a third party interlopes into the situation. It is the regulation around the usufructuary interest that's important. In short, nothing of what we think we own is ours. We die and leave it behind. Houses have had generations passing through them. Those that lived in old houses hundreds of years ago no longer have use of that property. Those that die not understanding this can, though, prefer to stay around the material plane as ghosts. Not a very good way to progress one's soul, in my opinion. The mixed up world of the pharaohs was that material goods could be used in the afterlife, and superstition and ritual turned them into neurotics. They were doing rituals and ceremonies throughout the day. They were wasting their time and they were preparing for the afterlife. And that preparation involved the taking of material objects into the non-material world. Absolute stupidity, and also complete ignorance about the true nature of reality. So this pharaonic system was arrested development, and it was imposed by people who knew this. Well, to avoid neurosis and worry, it's important to understand these basics. The own nothing and be happy concept is what so-called elites have always done. An example is putting material assets into trusts, and that means that the grantor, the person who holds the property, transfers the asset to a third party or parties who act under the grantor's instructions through a deed or a set of rules. The asset is put in the hands of trustees. They take certain responsibilities and have no financial interest in the asset other than to keep it in good condition and not breach the grantor's wishes around the use of the asset. The trustees in turn keep everything in order for the beneficiaries who benefit from the use of the asset. So the trustees are in the middle, and they are really holding the property for the true keeper of the property. Remember, not the owner, because all property comes from the divine. So, yeah, the trustees keep everything in order for the beneficiaries, and it's the beneficiaries who benefit from the use of the asset. So, in other words, it's better to do things this way. And the elites know this because they do not actually own everything or anything. They have usufruct of it, but they want control of everything. Very different thing, that. So I was actually a trustee of a small independent trust which was set up in 1920, and my job as a trustee was to carry out the wishes of the charitable trust, and that's all I had to do. I had no legal standing, I had no legal status in the system, but if I did step outside and breach my responsibilities, there would be penalties for that. And this is why we have so much fraud in the charity sector, because people can get away with it. But look at those grifters who just got caught. The Uncle Tom, what was it? Uncle Tom, not Uncle Tom, it was Captain Tom. Was it Captain Sir Tom? Sorry, the man of many titles who wandered around his back garden in times of COVID. Well, of course, his family were dishonourable and they put the money in their back pockets. That's a simple breach of trust. So it's simple and effective, this way of looking at the world. So in other words, if you think of the property as some kind of asset rather than something you own, something will change in your mind. And that is why people who have a higher level of thinking put property into a trust, because they know that that property is going to survive their death. So who's going to have it afterwards? Who's going to have use of it? So the beneficiaries of that property are really the people who benefit. It is not the holder of the property or the people who administer on behalf of the holder or the grantor. It is the people who benefit from the use of the property. Again, beneficiaries have a usufructuary interest in the property. Well, it's simple and effective, isn't it? And this can prevent parasites from usurping the asset, and it has certain protections in law. And yes, having been a trustee and had responsibilities both to the grantor and the beneficiaries, I would say it is a system that works and one that the law is in accord with. All of this depends on the upholding of the law, of course, and we do live in an age of land piracy and communitarianism, where a third party can come in on the back of something which they call community and take property from you. And that very nearly happened in the case of this small charity. But the actual legal system did have remedies in place for this. But if I hadn't known them and we hadn't used them, then the property could easily have been taken by land pirates. So where the rights of the individual are usurped by the supposed and imposed rights of what is called a community, then we have a massive imbalance in this system. And these can also be described, these people, as privateers or land pirates. So the trust property of which I was a trustee managed to survive this usurping of the law, but only through High Court intervention. The main point is the understanding of what ownership actually means. That's why I went into explaining that. Going back again to the ability to understand language. Well, attachment to material objects is anti-divine. If all property comes from God, then property comes from the divine. It would therefore be foolish to try and take ownership on a personal level or for personal gain. Attachment to objects is not healthy for the mind. The conditioning of material atheism is a control system. It is a conditioning mechanism. Those behind it know the rules. They know these rules that we cannot truly own anything. They can impose this fear of loss through imposed beliefs, however, and we own only our thoughts and actions, so we must take full responsibility for them. The thing people were concerned about in the article that I referred to, the Own Nothing and Be Happy article, was that a third-party interloper in the form of technocratic and parasitical globalists would have an overt control over everything and everyone. This is the aim of corporations and financial parasites and even certain self-appointed so-called elites, because we've actually gone beyond national government now. We are into this globalism phase, which I have written much about and done many shows on. This is to get rid of the idea of ownership by the state of a legal entity or person. And we can go back to the 1600s when we're looking at this, so this is nothing new. Charles II of England furthered the Poor Laws and the Settlement and Poor Relief Acts of 1662. And this saw the issuing of something called settlement certificates. These were the equivalent of a birth certificate, a passport and social security number in one document. This was the first occasion when a document proving domicile became statutory. And these were called, as we've said, settlement certificates. They were usurped by the birth certificate and the Births, Deaths and Registrations Act in 1836 or 1837, depending where you were. So this was a registration document, the settlement certificate. You were deemed to be a thing, a person or property on a roll through registration within a parish. Again, transference of your name at birth as a title onto a register, as in property, and through a deed. This was the settlement certificate, which became the birth certificate. So the law of settlement has been described by lawmakers as possibly one of the worst laws ever passed by a British Parliament. It gave a newcomer to a parish the right to a settlement and thus the right to poor relief in any place where he had lived unchallenged for 40 days. During this period, following complaint to the church wardens, the person could be ordered back to his place of last settlement unless he was renting a property worth £10 a year. The upholding of this law and its subsequent amendments, which only finally disappeared in 1948, led to even more confusion, more argument, and, of course, profits for the legal profession. And that is the case for virtually any other piece of legislation since. In other words, the Certificate of Settlement and the Poor Relief Act made more money for the legal profession than anything since. Quite incredible when you think about it, isn't it? The 1697 Act stated that those in receipt of poor relief were required to wear in red or blue cloth on their right shoulder the letter P preceded by their initials and letter of the parish. So you would have your initial and then the first letter of the parish on your arm, on the right shoulder. And this would designate you as a pauper, someone who was in benefit of poor relief or who was a beneficiary of the workhouse. So if vagrant and or not in employment, the pauper would get the benefits of the workhouse. So if you were found to be vagrant or you were brought in front of the magistrates and you weren't renting a property for £10 a year, you could either be sent back to your original place of dwelling in the borough where you came from, or put into the workhouse. Mostly people were put into the workhouse. This was only discontinued in 1810. And the 1834 Poor Law was to deter the taking of benefits by the poor and encourage the public to take better care of their own health. The last workhouse, also known as the Poor Law Institution in Britain, closed in 1948, which was the same year the National Health Service and the UN were legally incorporated. Something to think about there, about systems of governance. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. So, let's now talk about incorporation through registration. Now we understand a little bit more and have had a bit of background about what it actually really means to own nothing and be happy. You have a legal incorporation through registration. This is how it works. So, this is not the real you. It represents you. It is what is known as a legal fiction. And the technocratic update of this is the digital ID. The idea of this is to centralise all personal information and actions for the new form of original sin, overconsumption and responsibility for climate change, and this will result in penalties and restrictions upon not only your movements, theoretically, but also your finances. A deceptive, updated system of control based on lies and rolled out through corporations on behalf of governments. The idea that artificial intelligence can cut off your ability to draw out currency is valid. It's something to be concerned about. But whether it will work is in a way up to how one reacts to it and gets around it to their own advantage. We have to remember that the way that things have been rolled out so far has been completely ineffective, and the system can easily be taken down. And that is a huge disadvantage to those who want to get this form of technocratic control. The starting point of knowing how to do this, though, is solely in the mind of the person and how much they are actually aware of. When dealing with these financial parasites and land pirates, new rules outside the imposed system will actually come into play for those who are competent enough to get round it all. COVID was a fine example of how incompetent the parasites really are. Most things could be gotten around. Most of what was said was just a bluff. And the legal requirements around it were also quite interesting, because many people thought that they were not allowed to travel. They were allowed to travel. They were allowed to travel without being injected or suffering any form of inconvenience. The only inconvenience was that they had to get a piece of paper called a PCR test. And many people still think to this day that you could not travel during those times without being injected. This was completely untrue. So the starting point of knowing how to do all this is solely in the mind of the person and how much they are aware of. And when dealing with financial parasites and land pirates, new rules outside the imposed system will come into play for those who are competent enough to get round it. Just to repeat those points. So it is known that the financial parasites will benefit. The legal system says persons are property and things are property. When you know that, and you know in effect you own nothing, you really can be happy. And with this in mind, the metaphorical balancing of the books should become easier. Well, personally, I've saved a fortune by knowing what information is actually required by law and what is coercion or even fraud. And once we know a system is based on fraud, it is a moral duty to act accordingly and get round it in any way one can. And this goes into, for instance, forms that are given out by authorities, which can include the police, councils and corporations who are partnered with government agencies, and indeed the government agencies themselves. This knowledge includes the interpretation of words in the law system, the difference between what is actually being said and what people believe is being said. Again, we go back to that fine example of COVID and we look at the drop-down paragraphs. The third paragraph said, or this PCR test, which was actually a complete fraud within itself. And therefore, it was usurped by many people because the people who are actually selling these certificates knew it was a fraud also. So you were just really paying a mafia an extra tax. That's all it was, nothing more. So this is interesting, the difference of what is actually required and what is being requested, or what appears to be being requested, which is actually the more important point. There's a big difference between these two. Therefore, the system of law used currently is a deception and a deliberate one. However, it is in the true sense legal. An ignorance of the law is no excuse. That's an old Roman maxim. For instance, notices of prosecution, the issuing of fines, and the legal framework of identification. The root of knowing all of this comes from what we were talking about at the very beginning of this show. But you have to use your mind, which is why this is discouraged. You are not property. The soul cannot be property. Once we identify with the material, we lose all our divine power. The old Roman system, and even worse, the one that followed, all use this principle. That which is not material is outside the legal framework of property and registration. The soul is not material and it is not property. So in other words, your mind is your property. Your mind is your only property, and your actions are your only property in the respect of your ability to take control. So you control your mind and you control your actions. You are responsible for those things. You are the caretaker of this, which was given to you by the Creator. And it is outside the jurisdiction and the imposition of any third party. So why don't people look after their own minds and look after their own advancement and their own knowledge of where they are in the system and what the system should really mean to them? That is the key point here. So although the Vatican have assumed this to be part of their property, including your soul, with these other black magic cults, which is what that's all about. Controlling the soul of people is all about black magic. This selling of the soul has to be done with consent, however. The other point brought up in the I Own Nothing article was, I have no privacy. Well, privacy, again, has to be defined. The right to privacy has to be defined. In this system, there is no unlimited right to privacy. Many focus on the trivial side of what this may mean, though, and to them within the system, rather than the real definition. And what this article refers to is the monitoring of transactions and use of data around consumption of commodities, not necessarily being monitored in day-to-day actions, although this, of course, is all possible and to an extent used and all sold on to corporate interests, because data is sold. It's worth money. The fun is actually learning how to get around as much of it as possible and actually seeing it as a learning process and a project. There are already people living like the narrator in this article, and there will always be those who are. Where does this come from? It comes from laziness. It comes from a false argument around public security. The role of privacy is to protect rights. There is no online privacy, but there are ways to keep things private. I'm not just talking about using a VPN, but using knowledge of how it all works. And those who would succumb to convenience and technocracy, living in smart apartments, are believed to be, by the technocrats, the majority. And those who resist will be swept along in fake movements, which will steer them back into the technocratic system. Well, this will never work for those who understand the concepts we've discussed here. This is why the mind is the most important tool. The system of incorporation of the person as a legal entity and property again goes back to the 1600s. And under the Settlement Act and Poor Relief Act of 1662, it was forbidden to move from town to town without the appropriate settlement certificate. The pauper could be examined and allowed to stay if he could support himself, or he would be removed or put in the workhouse, as we just said. But this is also important, that a child's birthplace was its place of settlement unless its mother had a settlement certificate from some other parish stating that the unborn child was included on that certificate. And getting to the most important point here, after the age of 7, the child could be apprenticed and gain a settlement for itself through indentured service. So we have very, very comfortable lives compared to the 1600s, when there was real slavery. People these days suffer from materialism and debt slavery. But much of this is actually a choice if we are able to refine our mindset and to put into perspective that which really matters. And most who complain about the technocratic parasites are accepting the benefits given by them. That was always the irony. They were accepting the benefit services, the services of the state, the benefits of the state, many of them on universal credit, many of them taking unemployment benefit. Well, this is all about sovereignty of mind. Of course, one can accept benefits from the state and still have their own uniqueness and have their own divinity. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about the way the system actually sees us and how it works, and people's misconception of how the system works. So, most do complain about the technocratic parasites, but are accepting the benefits given by them. Own nothing and be happy has always been the philosophy of elites. The ability to know what property and ownership means will certainly be a major benefit to those who want to advance their minds. The parasites are transparent in their motives, and once one knows the difference between the real goals and what they present as the cover story, everything makes sense. The common good of all is the common good of the few. Any advanced society knows these basics, and if it doesn't, It is as doomed as those who go against the transparency of the natural order of intelligence. So this use of the term the common good just means it's an imposition from above that masquerades as the opinions of a community. It's just dictatorial. It's called communitarianism, and we've covered it for many years. So the striving for providence through right action will work. There is no point getting caught up in the false arguments of ownership, especially over transitory trivialities. Sorry, I need a drink here. Transitory even trivialities. So, having looked at that and given a bit of information, I think that to be happy is to own your own mind and your own actions. So, I hope that was useful and some of those concepts resonated. We will be back in a different form over the coming weeks because I will be coming off the Spreaker platform. We will go to Podbean and I will keep up the live shows on there. And I may be using another platform also to do live streams. So stay in touch through the website. Do support us if you can. And remember, if you want to get in touch, it's info@windowsontheworld.net.
In the passage of time, there will always